The problem that we have right now in 2022 is very, very different to the problem that we had 50 years ago. The problem that we have now is that there is just so much information out there. Whatever you want to become an expert in, there are literally endless YouTube videos, podcasts, books, blog posts, all that you can access for free from the world's experts in those fields. So the next dilemma we have is, how can we absorb as much information as humanly possible in the shortest amount of time? For much of my life, this was a massive problem that I had because there is such a vast, almost overwhelming pool of knowledge out there to learn, and I actually ended up learning very little, meaning I'd read a page in a book and literally 1 second after reading the entire page, I'd have forgotten everything on that page. Or even if I did remember some parts of the page, that information would only be stored in my short-term memory, meaning that I would remember it, but within 24 hours, I'd have completely forgotten everything again. So now imagine if there was some kind of memory hack where you could remember everything that you read, everything that you watched on YouTube, everything that you listened to in a podcast. And that's what we call speed learning. After just a year, you'd be an absolute genius, right? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. The key underlying fundamental idea behind speed learning is to take some information, and naturally that information will go straight into your short-term memory, right? But the problem with that is within 24 hours, you probably forget about it, right? So the idea of speed learning is to take that information, process it in your short-term memory, but then process it even more using a few methods that we're going to talk about later on in this video, therefore allowing it to be stored in your long-term memory. And that right there is the key, to store all the information you process into your long-term memory. So let me take you back to the example I used earlier where I read a book in a textbook and I'd completely forget everything I read within literally less than 5 seconds of finishing the page. Now that right there was probably the biggest fundamental mistake I made time and time again throughout high school, and that's why I graduated high school with such poor grades, because I just wasn't able to retain anywhere near as much information as I was capable of. And there's a study in 2014 carried out at the Princeton University that explains exactly why. So the researchers split up a class into two groups. The first group of students were told to prepare for an exam by taking handwritten notes of the lectures throughout that semester, whereas the second group of students were told to prepare for the exam by typing out their notes. Because typing out notes is faster and more efficient than handwriting notes, that group of students ended up with twice as many notes as the group of students that took handwritten notes, even though the researchers made sure that both groups were putting in the same number of hours into their studying. The aim of the study was to see which method would result in higher exam grades at the end of the semester, and interestingly, they found that the group that took handwritten notes, even though they had far fewer notes by the end of the semester, they actually scored twice as well than the group that typed out their notes. The study concluded that the reason why the students with the handwritten notes scored higher in their exams was because they put in more effort while taking their notes. It took them a longer time to write out the same amount of information, meaning that they had more time to kind of process that information, therefore moving that information over to their long-term memory. And that right there is the key to learning anything fast. It's about the transfer of information from the short-term memory over to the long-term memory. And the more effort you put into thinking about and processing the information, the more it cements into your long-term memory. So again, let's take us back to the example of reading a page in a textbook. What can we do to make sure that we actually remember the information that we read on the page? So you can take handwritten notes on the key points of the page. You can ask questions to yourself and then answer them, therefore kind of forcing you to actively think about what you just wrote. There's a reason why textbooks at the end of each chapter usually have a list of questions for you to answer, right? Because they want you to process and recall the information so that it moves from your short-term memory over to your long-term memory. Another really good method is to summarize the entire page of the textbook in 1 or 2 sentences in your own words, because if you can't do that, then the chances are that you don't completely understand what you just wrote. And this is something that the sponsor of this video, Brilliant, do really well. So Brilliant are an educational platform that replace boring lecture videos with hands-on interactive problem solving, and they know exactly how the mind processes information. They know exactly how to present information so that you're able to store that information into your long-term memory, so you don't just forget it straight away, right? right? So instead of just reading paragraphs of text, they guide you through STEM subjects with fun, interactive problems where you can practice with real problem solving. And every problem comes with a step-by-step solution that helps you kind of understand the reasoning for each step. I've been slowly making my way through the Computer Science Fundamentals course, where it teaches about computational thinking from everyday tasks to algorithms. And although the stuff that is being taught is actually quite complex, in my opinion at least, Brilliant have an amazing way of breaking down these topics in a very simple, digestible way. And Brilliant have a wide range of courses covering math, science and computer science, so if you're studying any of those subjects, or even if you're just curious, I do recommend you check them out. You can join the millions of people already learning on Brilliant. Get started for free at brilliant.org/Product Elon. The link is in the description, and if you click that link, the first 200 listeners will receive 20% discount off their annual membership subscription. It's easy to kind of trick yourself into thinking you know the topic. It's called the illusion of competence, but recognizing a topic is very different to understanding it. The easiest way to test yourself to know if you actually do understand the topic on a deeper level is if someone asked you to explain it in depth, right? You should be able to explain it in very simple terminology. As theoretical physicist Richard Feynman once said, if you cannot explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it. So there's a very strong correlation between the effort that you put into learning something and how long you retain that information for. So the more effort you put into actively kind of thinking about something and asking questions and taking notes, the more of that information you move into your long-term memory. It's what I'm going to call the principle of most effort. It's based off the principle of least effort, which is kind of a broad theory that states that us as human beings are inherently lazy and will always naturally choose the path of least resistance or least effort, right? And it's the same with animals. A lion isn't going to try and take down the strongest wildebeest in the herd, right? It's going to choose the weakest and the slowest, right? So the principle of most effort is going against what is natural for us. And everything that we read, everything that we watch, we make a conscious effort to process that information. So I have a client that I've been coaching for the last 5 or 6 months, and she works in finance in London. She's a really smart person, and she was quite an interesting approach. She only watches one educational YouTube video at a time, and I think that's the opposite to most of us, including myself, honestly, because she'll be watching that one video and she'll process the information and she'll sit on it for a while and she'll think about it, can maybe make some notes, and that way she's kind of able to remember long term all the information in that entire video. It's like on the way to work, my commute is about 25-30 minutes and I listen to podcasts. Now, listening to podcasts on the one hand is a really efficient way of learning because you're using what is essentially dead time, so time that isn't really productive. It's just you doing something that you need to do that day, like commuting, and you're filling it with listening to educational podcasts, so you're essentially downloading knowledge into your brain, right? Which is awesome. However, at the same time, it's an extremely inefficient way of learning too, because let's say with a 1-hour podcast, you'll actually only remember about 1 or 2 kind of golden nuggets of information in that entire podcast, and most of it, like 95-96% of it, you probably forget within 24 hours because it's an extremely low effort way of learning. So a kind of hack that I've been using over the last few months is when I'm commuting and listening to a podcast, in a 1-hour podcast there'll be like, I don't know, 3 or 4 kind of light bulb moments or golden nuggets, if you like. It's the same like reading a book, right? When you read a book, you don't remember every single detail, right? And there are usually about 4 or 5 takeaways that you really remember long term. So when I'm commuting, listening to a podcast, and I hear something that I need to take note of so I can come back to it later on to kind of essentially transfer it from my short term to long term memory, I'll just say to my phone, hey Siri, take a note. And then I'll dictate the notes and it'll save it in my notes app. And I'm sure you can do the same thing with Android too. I just found it a really kind of efficient way of turning a relatively inefficient way of learning into a far more efficient way of learning. Right now, and over the last few months, I've been studying very intensely on the area of blockchain and Web 3.0. I have another business that is kind of in that niche, and so it's important for me that I become somewhat of an expert in that field within the next 12 months. And this video was kind of a generalized perspective on how to learn anything fast through speed learning, but I made another video called How I Absorb Information Fast, the Sponge Effect, where I go through my own personal information processing strategy to learn huge amounts of information in a very short space of time. You can check it out by clicking on the card on the screen. If you liked this video, I'm almost certain that you're gonna love that video, because honestly, that's just a better video in my opinion. Alternatively, I made another video on how I train myself to study smart. Again, a really important video on how to memorize vast amounts of information very fast. And do check out this video's sponsor, Brilliant. If you are studying a STEM subject, it could be absolutely invaluable for you. There's a link in the description below.